emails per day. So people do email us on a regular basis, working from a constituency office. Like everyone else, we had to close our office and work from home. My staff have been absolutely superb. We've had, but our daily email system has shot up, and some days we've been swamped by emails. But we'll work through them. Concern regarding workplace, furlough, school placements, essential workers, you name it, we've received it. Health, furlough, council issues, refuse collection, social distances, we've had it, we've dealt with it, and constituents' concerns, and we've always been accessible. And we've worked well with every agency, and that's why I'm saying I'd look forward to working with you and with anyone before I retire, sadly, in March of next year. But sadly, people think you can wave a magic wand and get an answer quickly. It really does surprise me. In a pandemic, most people think you can reply to them with an answer to their problem within a day or so. In normal times, councils, NHS, government have 28 days. That's 28 working days to reply to us. And the NHS and government and councils have been swamped by emails from MPs and MSPs. But I have to say they've stepped up to the mark. So everybody's been working hard. The Scottish Government also set up a special COVID-19 email address if we wished a quicker answer, which worked well. It's all worked well, but there have been problems. During my council days, I was called Kenwood the Mixer. So I tended to go straight to the problem, direct, talk with firms, phoned up quite a number of firms when their employees are concerned about social distances. So we've maintained that direct contact. We've had direct contact with ministers and government. It's quite good when you can corner them in the Parliament, and that works wonders. I work with two councils in my area who have reacted mainly, but not all the time, to my requests. It does take time to change policy, get the results you're looking for, but if you keep at it, it happens. After 36 years in the council, I learned a lot. Local NHS has also been superb. Each of my staff have that particular field. What has annoyed me is how many sections were not covered by funding set up to help people at this time, the amount of applications refused by councils. But when I told them that they had the discretion to grant, the amount of appeals were granted with a covering letter for me has been amazing. Everybody working from home has worked. You know, it has been a new norm. But sometimes constituents don't understand that there are timescales, and we have to work through it. I've never taken no for an answer, so I keep raising issues. We've worked well during the lockdown, continue to do so, and it's part and parcel of a politician's job. If you ask what has not worked well, it's been the different timescales of COVID between Scotland and England. People watching the UK government nightly COVID press conferences forget that we are roughly 2 to 3 weeks behind England. So our easing of the lockdown is later in Scotland. That's the emails I'm now getting. Can you open up the schools? Oh, I don't want to go back to work. I'm afraid. So this is the point. There's been different dates put about, which is confusing people, and sadly think it's all over, but it's not. So we'll keep to the rules. As of COVID has put most of the preparation for reselection of MSPs back several months. Our parties still hasn't started it yet, and I think it won't be happening until around about October. I'm standing down in Uddingston and Belsill after next year will be 45 years I've been a politician. So I think it's about time I stood down. Basically, it will be an all-women list. I think there will be a lot of issues that will have to be looked at. Have we started it yet? No, I don't think so, because most of us have been spending so much time in COVID. In regard to meeting MSPs, keep emailing them. Yeah, phone them up. And if at the best, you might even pop along when these come back again, back to surgeries. People have always been surprised when they phone me. I remember one morning I got a phone call at 10, and I said to the person, "Oh, I'm free at 2 o'clock." "Oh, what day?" "This afternoon," which surprised them intensely. I will sit and listen to you. I may not agree with you, but I don't see why people don't meet and talk, because I think it's good to talk. And that's what we should promote after this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's absolutely brilliant. Before we go on to Nicola, I'd just quite like the attendees to complete a wee poll just so that we can understand what your main concerns. So are you managing to find that it's good to talk, as Richard would say? Is it about getting access or getting their attention? So it'd be great if you could just cast your vote so we can understand. And we'll share the results once everyone's had a chance to cast their votes. Okay. So I'm just going to share the results of this. So people are saying that difficult to get traction and trying to get access to people and perhaps don't know where to start and trying to get their organisational agenda to fit with that. So that gives us hopefully a useful context for the rest of the webinar. Okay, so Nicola, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and I'm quite glad that that poll came out the way it did, because I would be worried otherwise. You asked me to just sum up really what's worked particularly well over the last few months in terms of political influence, and not just political but stakeholder influence. For me, the key thing has been regular dialogue with politicians and the civil servants. For a certain stage throughout the lockdown, we ended up having weekly meetings in the diary, and knowing that they were coming up and everybody knew that there was work to be done in between the times really, really helped, and which made us get some really great successful outcomes during this really difficult time for the industry. Things like the SME home builder funding loan fund, which was launched, was an absolute lifesaver, and I don't use that word lightly. We've had companies tell us that they would have gone out of business had it not been for that money, so it has been brilliant, but there was a lot of work in the background to get that off the ground. Also looking at how we're coming out of this, the lockdown being eased and making sure that construction and housing were in phases 1 and 2, having to demonstrate to government that we understood the challenges and that we would work really hard to deliver what they needed to give them comfort that we could move forward. And so I'm delighted that this coming Monday, home moves will be allowed again. I won't touch on the planning successes because I don't want to steal Tony's thunder. I know that there's been some great work done there with the Chief Planner and the Housing Minister. And there have been other things like building standards. We've worked really closely with them, looking at the digital way of providing building warrants and completion certificates. So some real practical solutions there. Going forward, what we need to consider for the future, it's interesting that people don't know how to access politicians and can't get traction with them. That's kind of what Homes for Scotland and other organisations are there for. You're not on your own. If you're a company, you can guarantee that there will be an organisation out there that can represent you. It may be house building and it'll be us, or it might be somebody else. But I'm also not on my own as Homes for Scotland. We join forces with other membership organisations when it suits. So Scottish Property Federation and ourselves have been in dialogue about tax incentives we might need, short-term LBTT relief or something like that. So we won't go in on our own to speak to the government. We'll try and have a joined up approach so that we're not contradicting each other, which would really defeat the purpose. But we can use each other to amplify our voice. So that's something that's really important. So even if you just join one organisation, don't think that we're not speaking to others. I know somebody from SFHA is on the call. I work really closely with Sally on issues that interest us both as well. So it just depends on the cause, and you pick your partner depending on the cause. for me as well, all this time, it's really highlighted for me the importance of longer term relationships. It's really difficult to start a conversation with a politician or a civil servant or another stakeholder now, doing it remotely, if you've never met them before. And using that analogy of, the best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago, but the second best time is now. If you have to build relationships with people digitally, well, you just have to try your best and use all your skills that you have on building rapport with somebody. You might find that it's a phone call rather than an email. I actually find Teams is pretty useful one-to-one. It's not quite as good as being in the same room as somebody, but it's not that far off it, especially if it's just one person. You can see the whole face on the screen. And I find I'm actually speaking to people far more by just picking up a Teams meeting once a week, whereas you would maybe plan a meeting in your diary. It's 3 weeks away, you've then got to build in travel time, all of these things. It's actually easier to slot in quite a few of these team calls during the course of a day. I think you've got to show your human side, regardless of who you're trying to influence. You have to let them or remind them that you're a human, just as it's important to remember that politicians are as well. As Richard was saying, we can talk about everything, we won't necessarily agree, but you have to be civil, professional, and remember you can get on really well with people. Sometimes you might not build that rapport, but as long as you behave in a professional manner, the chances are that you can have a really good conversation. And whether you make progress isn't always up to you. It'll be up to a whole range of other things. So you've got to keep that strategic thought in your head that you're a small cog in a very large wheel, whether it's house building within the wider economy or whatever. And politicians are sitting there trying to look at all of it in the round. So try not to take it personally when you don't get the answer you want, and just keep going and put forward your case as well as you can.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicola. As ever, very practical, straightforward, and very insightful advice. Tony, what's your views over the last of what's worked well for you and where you see us going?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think from my point of view, what's worked well is how resilient the planning system's actually been. We're very used to technology and planning portals. So really these days, all planning applications are loaded up in that manner, as are planning appeals to the DEPA. So the planning system's been really resilient because it's allowed applications to continue to be lodged or appeals to be carried through. So well in advance of the current situation, all this technology has been well used by all planners for many years now. So that's proved really useful in the circumstances upon which we found ourselves in. I suppose what was also pleasing, and Nicola touched upon it, was actually the coronavirus bill and the planning aspects of that. From the outside looking in, obviously, Nicola was having key conversations with important stakeholders to get that pulled together. But from the outside looking in, as a planning consultant, what I was really pleased with was the speed at which it was delivered and some of the issues it sought to address. I know there's lots of meetings with the Homes for Scotland, Scottish Property Federation, and the planning officers, heads of planning officers in Scotland as well. So that real collaborative working, I felt from the outside looking in, seemed to shine through with the coronavirus bill and some of the actions coming out of that. What we did, one of the key actions was extend planning permissions for a year. In Scotland, we did it very quickly. It's only actually been done in England this week. And a lot of my English clients have looked on quite enviously at the speed at which we made that decision north on the border, and were really bewildered as to why the MCLG couldn't do likewise south on the border. So, there's things that happened here, positive actions in which were kind of leading the way, to be honest. And I thought that was really useful. From a real practical point of view, for us as consultants, pre-application consultation's key. We engage with politicians like Richard, and it's really about delivering positive messages and full information. And I think, as Richard touched upon, whether or not he agrees with a development scheme which I or my clients promote, the very least we can do is give him full information. In my experience, there's nothing a politician doesn't thank you for, is people knocking his door about a development scheme before you've actually informed the politician about it. So you just got to get your information out there fully at the outset, whether it be councillors, MSPs or MPs. And what we've been seeking to do with virtual consultation events is we're communicating with all these various politicians, but perhaps just in a slightly different way. No, we're not meeting them in person, but we dealt with a scheme in Scotland where we were able, a few of the politicians were on Twitter, so we were able to, via our Twitter accounts, indicate to them that there's a virtual consultation event going on in their constituency if they could retweet it for us, and they did. So what we ended up doing is, for one virtual consultation event we did in May, we did the same consultation event before lockdown, and we had 100 people through the door in person in February, and we had 25 responses. And that was a reasonable response for a major development scheme. But in the 3 weeks we had the virtual consultation, we had 3,000 viewings of our consultation material, and we had 100 comments. So we felt that the virtual consultation went to a broader and wider cross-section of people who maybe are time hungry in terms of turning up in person, but can cut out 15, 20 minutes in an evening to maybe review something online which maybe suits them from their own home. So we felt the virtual consultations have went particularly well, and taking that forward in the future, that's something we'll be working into consultations with clients going forward in the future for their development schemes. Other matters that perhaps took a little while to get going was local authorities to actually make decisions and get committees back up and running. Clearly there's a little bit of unsettledness to begin with, and actually, you know, most authorities are now back up and running and making virtual decisions. There's actually a few who still aren't, and there are a handful, but that's disappointing, to be honest. I think one of my aspects which I believe in is we've got to, you know, we're coming into an economic period which is going to be quite challenging. In my view, is via development schemes, we can assist the economy moving forward over the next few years, and that's certainly the message which I'm keen to get out there to people like Richard, that really the key elements are that development can create jobs, it can create opportunities, and I think that will be really important over the next few years.
Great, thank you very much, Tony. Before we move on to Devon, I'd like to just do another poll just to understand where people are at in terms of if they're doing more or less influencing, and have they started trying to influence manifestos. So I'll just get you to answer those questions. Take a few seconds to answer the questions. Okay, just finish the end the polling. So very interesting that people are saying they're doing more influencing since lockdown, which is interesting, but most haven't started planning the approach to manifestos and not started to try to influence those manifestos yet. I'll just share those results so you can see those. So Devon, over to you.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Julie. I think I'd like to start by replaying probably the most significant thing that's been said so far is from Tony, when he said we get in early to speak to politicians. And as Julie knows, it is one of my mantras, the earlier you get in to speak to elected members, especially if it's going to be about planning development, but even if it's something on a smaller scale or whatever, politicians, I think it's important we give them their place and their respect, and we let them know before they get a queue of people knocking on the door saying, what about this big house that's been built round the corner, or this big housing development? So we always recommend that the ward constituency member and MP and the ward councillors are the first to know. Occasionally some of the list members know, but it is quite surprising how seldom the list members have the remotest interest in anything that's going on in their area, but that's another story. It has undoubtedly been a challenge, and there is, I think I was saying to Julie just before we came live this morning that for the first time since lockdown, I had a politician this morning saying he wants to meet a client face to face. And that is the first, I'll be outside and socially distanced and all the rest of it. And that's the first time I've actually had that comment made. Most of my engagement with politicians has been either by email, by phone, occasional Zoom calls, text message, WhatsApp, and so forth. I suppose I'm lucky, as Richard knows, I've been round the block for, I think, longer than every politician, including, I think there's about, what, 14 left that have been there. No, I know you've done 45 years. I know. I only did 4 as a councillor, but I've been round the Holyrood since it started. So, and there's only about 14 left that have been there since the start. So, there's ways and ways, and you get to know that certain politicians have different ways of wanting to be approached. Certain, like Annabel Goldie famously would refuse to open mail that addressed her as Ms. Goldie. She just would tear it up and throw it in the bin. It had to be Miss Goldie, otherwise she wouldn't read the letter or open the email, for example. I think email undoubtedly has to be the first protocol for engaging with most politicians. I would certainly encourage callbacks either by phone or preferably by Zoom. It is possible to do Zoom and phone, so you can take your phone and say, look, there's this building site, and fairly soon we're going to have a 200-storey building overlooking Addington High Street. What do you think of that, Richard? And that way you will get an instant reaction. So it is possible, and I think Richard's right. We are about 2 weeks behind London, or behind the English system. So I think the chances are we probably will have a reduction of the 2 metre distance regulations, which will make it easier to engage with face-to-face regulations. I certainly have a backlog of politicians who are wanting to meet clients that we've been working with, relationships that we've been building up over a matter of years. They haven't quite gone dead, but when you can't actually show them anything new beyond just say, well, look, here's an email with an update, oh, well, very interesting, but look, we want to actually come and poke at things in laboratories and put white coats on and things like that. And these are the things that make stories. Since Perceptive started, we've always been integrated with public affairs and PR, and that's always been a winning combination. I think it will take longer before we get events happening again in the Scottish Parliament. Richard, I don't know whether you had any further update
January.
on that, but it will be.
I would think you wouldn't see any before January.
No, I've been inclined to agree with that, because you'd really need to close down any lockdown regulations before that happens. But it's undoubtedly getting MSPs and having a face-to-face meeting with them. You normally get 45 minutes to an hour with them, and that does create the relationship in which you can build. And once you've done it once, then you can do it again and again, especially if it's a building project that you're doing. Or if you're a trade body, then you just bring different people along next time, or you bring people from a different part of a sector and so forth. I have to say, I have found a number of MSPs. Don't worry, I'm not going to name names, but some MSPs have chosen lockdown as an excuse to hide, which has disappointed me.
Quite a few.
I bet you could. I think it's also fair to say one or two, and I will name Colin Beattie's wife did actually get the disease quite early on. So for obvious reasons, Colin is the SNP member for Midlothian North and Musselburgh, who we had two fairly substantial client projects in his area. I mean, he was shielding for 12 to 14 weeks, so there was just no way we could speak to him apart from on the phone. Yet he was desperate to come out. In fact, I actually had a date for him to come out. Then I had to phone up and say, look, sorry guys, I've just heard this news. There's no way I'm going to see you for the next 2 or 3 months. So I think, as I think one or two of you have said, it is a case of being persistent, realising that the world hasn't quite ended and that the COVID virus is going to come to an end. It's going to take a few months before we get back to anything approaching normality, whatever that was in the first place. But politicians need us to supply them with the raw material. I've always worked on the principle of never going to a politician unless it's either relevant to their constituency or to a committee or a cross-party group that I'm an active member of. As Richard will know, I don't think I've ever come to you with anything that's not directly relevant to either your area or anything that's relevant to your responsibilities. And
As always, I agree with you.
And that undoubtedly is the best mantra for them all. But there will be a rush of events in Holyrood. There will be a rush of people trying to get hold of MSPs. There will be a lot of MSPs running for the hills, just will not know how to deal with this because they don't get a massive budget for senior staff to deal with this. And as Julie touched on, come the end of March, we're going to reach dissolution, and then in May we're going to have a whole clutch of at least, I would imagine we'll have about 35 to 40 new MSPs.
Yes.
I think 19 so far have indicated they're resigning officially, and there'll be another half dozen more at least will go.
There's a few at this moment in time haven't they announced yet, but I know they're going.
Yes, yeah. Well, likewise, there's I think between us we could probably get the best part of 30. But either way, there will be a lot of new names and faces to get to know, and that's, I suppose, where our job as a consultancy sort of comes in to get to know these characters. I mean, some are better than others, but I think the key thing is just to be persistent. To remember that email is there. I find using the word constituency in the subject line of an email can work wonders in terms of getting an email read. Now, I would never suggest use it and then not have an email that relates to the constituency, but I guarantee a staffer that sees the word constituency issue in a subject line, when you get 200 emails from the Save the Whale Brigade to everything else in between, is likely to get read fairly quickly compared with all the others.
That's great. I really appreciate you pulling all that together. In terms of, I'm just conscious of time. So in terms of over the next 3 to 6 months, obviously the agenda has changed. So that will be a new normal. Richard, we've had a question of how can we influence, given that things are so different. What's your view if a constituent or an organisation had an issue? What's the best way to influence you?
I think personal contact. Devon's right in the respect that sometimes the emails you get, you could class 3/4 of them, pardon what I'm going to say, as mints. And basically you go delete, delete, delete. Where people capture my attention is using the word constituency and saying, did you know about this or know about that? Or we're going to provide, what's the one thing that every MSP wants? We're going to provide jobs. We're going to help you to meet your commitment to your constituency. So it's putting an email together which captures the first time and a phone call, right? Okay, you maybe can't go and also when they start back, go along to events. It's amazing. I attend as many events as I can. It's amazing the amount of people you meet. So, even, go to an event, even if it's just slightly touching what you do, go to a cross-party group, get to know people. And I think what you guys are doing is right. Get to know people. Once somebody knows your face, they'll talk to you.
Yep. So Nicola, that's back to your point, isn't it, about the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. So what are Homes for Scotland doing to build relationships, particularly maybe with people who you perhaps don't know or contacts that you don't know?
I guess we're in a fairly fortunate position that we have very strong relationships now with the Housing Minister and his civil service. During this lockdown, we've had to get to know a wider group of people across government, those in the construction side of things, the procurement teams, and it kind of goes back to that, you're not on your own, partner with other organisations which already have those relationships. So we've been doing work with Construction Scotland and sitting in on the calls about the construction restart with a lot of civil servants on that call who I didn't know before. I still have no idea what they look like, but I feel as though I know them really well now because you chat on the phone, you can then drop them an email. Something I think is really important, and it comes back to that human element, especially in this lockdown. We all have our own individual challenges, and it's beyond work. Are you homeschooling? Is your family well? Have you got the space and the peace in your home to do the work? And there's actually really easy conversations to have with people. And you build up a little bit of a relationship and then you talk about work. I always find that people that come straight on the phone and launch into what they want from you tend not to get a good reaction. They certainly don't get that from me. So I have to assume that other people will be similar. A little bit of courtesy goes a long way. And a bit like Richard, I love going to events and getting to know people, putting faces to names, and it does make it so much easier. Then next time you see them, you can have a slightly harder conversation. You can ask them for something, but you can remember that the wife had been ill. How is she? It's these really important human elements which I think help to smooth that. I've no idea if that answered your question, Julie.
You've got a dossier then. You've got a dossier on all of us.
Oh, yes. Richard, when I retire, there's going to be a bestseller and it's going to be that thick, I can tell you.
Tony,
it's good that someone asks how's your wife? People have asked me how my daughter is. She was shielding. They're actually staying with us along with my grandkids. They've been with us for 14 weeks. So basically people have asked, and it's good when people do take an interest in your personal circumstances.
Great. One of the questions we've had, which perhaps relates, Tony, back to the kind of things that you were saying about planning and how, planning will probably never be the same again as it was. And in fact, actually, it means that it's much more accessible for a wider representation of the population, which I think is good. But one of the questions that we've had is, should there be any changes to the Lobbying Act to reflect how we influence in future? I guess that relates to things beyond planning, but is there anything from a planning perspective you think should change?
From a planning perspective, there's going to be quite a lot on in the next 9 months, a year, which does coincide with elections. And as Nicola will know, we have a new Planning Act out, and clearly we've had a draft event for ideas for MPF4 to the end of April. Now, these things in terms of our timescales with the Scottish Government have been delayed slightly because of the pandemic, but there's lots to go for in planning over the next 6 months to a year. and there's going to be a new Scottish planning policy. So I think in terms of lobbying for planning and how policies are set out, to be honest, we usually go through organisations such as Homes for Scotland or Scottish Property Federation, because that speaks for a very broad church. And as Nicholas touched on, they have excellent links with all the key ministers and politicians in that regard. So beyond individual projects, there's a lot going to go on in planning over the next little while, and we've got to influence planning policy and the new Planning Act and how it all shapes up actually and is enacted via these groups have the most effective means to influence matters, in my professional opinion.
And Richard, do you think that there should be any changes to the Lobbying Act to reflect how we're doing business differently?
Well, I actually wouldn't have it in the first place. I think it's a silly bill. It annoys me when people suggest that MPs, MSPs or councillors are corrupt. We're all just the same as you. We're ordinary people trying to do the best for our constituents. And I actually have pushed planning applications where, one was getting refused because it was right next to a railway. So I wrote to the planning, the reporter, and said, do you know what? I stay 50 yards from the railway, and I don't hear the railway. Do you know what? That planning application was granted because I sent in that letter. I'm a developer. I'm not wanting to concrete everything. But I think if we want to move forward as a country, we've got to develop, and we need homes, we need jobs, we need to develop. And so carry on. I'm a listener. Sadly, other politicians aren't.
That's a valid point, Richard, that you've just made about the Lobbying Act. I mean, obviously I've got a vested interest on the other side. I think it's a waste of time because there are more holes in it than a Swiss cheese.
Well, if you talk to me in events, I even had one night, one chap, we were talking about, he says, oh, I'll need to record I've talked to you. I said, don't be stupid. No, I have to. And so he had.
No, but the point is, if the five of us were in the same room face to face, technically four of us would need to register this because we're talking to you about issues relevant to the Scottish Parliament.
You might need to register that I've been on this event today.
But the fact we're doing it on a webinar, but the fact we're doing it on a webinar, I'm not physically in the same room as you, so nobody cares. I mean, these are the anomalies that you've got. If you send me a dodgy email saying, send me 500 quid and I'll put that application through for you or support it, that's not registered or that's not covered. There is, however,
Put it this way, I would send it to Polis straight away. It annoys me, as I say, I've done this for 40 odd years. It annoys me that people call us crooks. You're only trying to do the best for your constituents and people. Neil Finlay, when he put up that and the government took it on, I just went, you've got to be joking. That's basically confirming that we are all crooks. Well, sorry, we're not.
Sorry.
No, but it doesn't cover emails, it doesn't cover phone calls, it doesn't cover webinars. Yeah. There are more exceptions than there are positive. Correct. It only covers in-person conversations.
Face-to-face and even face-to-face meetings in the Parliament. Technically, I could be in a pub in Edinburgh and you could walk in and we're sitting chatting away. Do you have to record that?
I have to say there's been one benefit which I hadn't expected, because I agree with Richard, I think it's a bit of a waste of time. But when we're measuring the performance of us as a lobbying organisation against others, and certainly pre the Planning Act, you could see how many times we'd interacted with those who are involved in that within government and within the Parliament against other organisations. It was a very useful tool to demonstrate to our members the benefit of membership. Yeah. Here's the number of times that we've been meeting. And I hadn't expected to get any benefits from having to fill in these forms. So there was one tiny one, but it doesn't outweigh having to do it, I have to say. I'd rather not have it at all.
Can I ask Richard, we've had a question about how much influence, so this is all about influencing politicians and stakeholders. Often it's civil servants and government advisors that have quite an influence as well, and sometimes they get forgotten about. So how much influence, I guess it depends on the situation, but in your, from your perspective, how much influence do these advisors have on you? And, you know, is it a bit of a balance of both, or if someone wanted to influence an issue, how would they go?
I'm maybe going to get
Don't punch the screen before you answer this one.
No, I used to say to ministers, and Devon will know the minister I'm talking about, is don't listen to your officials. You know, because officials, you know, people get so in a rut that they, you know, let's no change. If it's no broke, don't fix it. You know, yeah, I'll take what an official has said to me. I did as a councillor, but then I would go and try and change it if I didn't agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, but sadly there are ministers who, you know, it's a bit like Yes Minister, the old political satire that used to be on. You know, politicians are told by the officials they can't do this and do that. If you want to get anywhere in politics, you've got to be bold, and you don't listen to officials, because at the end of the day they're the ones who don't need to be re-elected. It's the politicians that need to be re-elected. So if you want to get something done, listen to yourself.
Devon, what's your experience of that?
I think I'm inclined to agree with Richard. I mean, I find most officials I speak to tend to be scared to speak to lobbyists, because they think that anything we tell them, if they happen to agree with them, and that information filters down to the minister, it will be perceived as though the lobbyist has influenced the minister. And if they disagree with it, well, it's neither here nor there. But more often than not, I mean, as you know, Julie, we tend to seek the right solution for clients. So we tend not to go in to speak to politicians or officials and come up with the wrong answer in the first place. So I think Richard is probably right. And I think one of my, I was very friendly with the late, wonderful David McLetchie, the former Tory leader. He used to call me his translator, because I could speak MSP speak, which always stuck in my head. But the Lobbying Act was just coming in when he sadly passed away a few years ago, and he was fuming with that, and he was saying that they are treating us as though we have got sort of zero intelligence. It doesn't cover officials, which is true. It does cover the most senior civil servant, and that's about it. But there are so many holes in it that it's just not workable. Yeah. And my strong view is, if you can get a politician persuaded that your viewpoint or your project is good for his or her area, then the chances are that will trickle down to the officials, to the civil servants, and to the people that are needed behind the scenes to make it happen. And that's why we spend so much of our time targeting politicians. And
if it's you touched on the very word earlier, constituency. If it's of benefit to my constituency and my constituents, that's what we were talking about. What's going to be in your manifesto? What was in my manifesto in 2016? Jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's what I campaigned on. So basically, that's what I suggest we do.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good example. We talked earlier about coordinating and integrating social media, public affairs and PR. And we worked really closely with Richard on securing jobs at BioCity a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And that was all about...
And what happened once you asked me to do that? You wanted it turned into an enterprise zone. What happened 2 months later? It was turned into an enterprise zone.
Aye, well, what we never told you is that we lost 3 years' work, because we told him it would take 3 years, and You're too damn
sorry.
efficient for us.
Well, you did ask me to do something, didn't you?
I know. You did a fantastic job, Richard. We're very appreciative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good example of not taking no for an answer, because I think originally when we'd asked, the enterprise zone wasn't even under consideration for another few years. But we pulled together a really effective campaign and you know, had lots of discussions with Richard explaining why this was beneficial for the constituency. So I think it's about how do you use those tools, if you like, and the relationships that you've got, and also understanding, you know, clearly Richard's agenda is about his constituents and about jobs. And so think about perhaps who are the MSPs that you're trying to, or the people you're trying to influence, and bring that agenda.
Yeah, so Julie, what I would say to people who are listening in is target, if in your particular sphere, your target it to the relevant member. And if once you do that, I think you'll open up a lot of doors.
Okay, great.
That's wise advice. Yeah.
Okay, so we've had a number of other questions, really relating to, obviously we're still very much focused, we're not out of the woods yet by any stretch in terms of COVID, but you know, is that in your view, Richard, likely to continue to dominate politics, or how do we bring on other subjects that are very important? You know, you mentioned jobs earlier, it's a good example.
Well, after COVID, how many people are going to be, you know, unemployment was going down, but after COVID, how many people are, that's the email that I'm starting to get now. And basically what, you know, what we're going to do after COVID. And this will go on for the next maybe month or so, and then we'll get back to a rough and tumble of preparing for the election. Now, even a month or so ago, there was a discussion on whether the elections would be put back or not. I don't know. I don't think so. But basically, I think as we move.
Surely not by me. Surely not by me, Richard. I mean, we've already lost the London and the English elections by a year. I mean,
well, you know, it depends. You know, there's a lot of bills that the Parliament is going to fall by the wayside. That you know, we've lost 3 months. You know, but I'm not suggesting that'll happen. You know, that it has been what they call the talk of the steamy. But basically, we'll get back to the usual. You know, what's coming up. Schools open on 11th of August. They're going to be safe. The teachers are going to be safe. The kids are going to be safe. Basically, the health service back into the wrangle about Mrs. McShuggle. And I could stand in that chamber and stand up and say about my constituents, but I don't, because I get it done through the NHS by sending an email. But the next thing, we'll go back to the same old as health, education, transport, all the pre stuff before the next election.
Great. So I'm just going to move to our final poll and get the attendees to vote. Thank you very much to our panelists for some really useful insights. I think it's all about, and although obviously we're living in a different world, the relationship building and the human touch is still really important. It's all about communication and making sure that your agenda somehow ties in with whoever you're trying to influence's agenda. And really, I think, don't take no for an answer, and you know, keep plugging away. We're delighted to help support that, and we would be happy to have a no obligation discussion with anyone who's listening to the webinar. And if you need an extra pair of hands, we'd be happy to help with that. And really appreciate everybody listening to the webinar. So I'm just going to end the polling, and I'm delighted to say that we have got 100% of people said that they felt the webinar was worthwhile.
I should think so too. Cheap at half the price.
So
and I would say your company does a lot of good work. So good luck.
Thank you, Richard. That's appreciated, and we will get our tour around Parliament rearranged at some point.
Anytime, I'm more than happy to do a tour and even maybe take you into the members bar.
Well,
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that was very kind of you to offer. We were going to do a behind-the-scenes tour of the Scottish Parliament with Richard hosting us, but hopefully once we get out of lockdown, we'll be able to do that, and I'll very much look forward to that.
Just to finish off, my events, I generally take people up after events. The most people I've taken up to Chamber at one time was 50. So if you want to bring 50 people, that's fine.
Well, there you go. So now we've got a LinkedIn group, then I'll make sure we put that post on our LinkedIn group. So thank you very much to the panelists, and thanks very much to the attendees for listening in. Thank you very much.
thanks, Julie.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Julie.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.